This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Design and Architecture Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bordone. This week, our guest is James Corner.
James is the founding partner and CEO of Field Operation, a landscape architecture and urban design office.
Yes, and you're probably familiar with Field Operations already. They've done many notable projects over the years. The ones that first come to mind for us as former New Yorkers and well, you're not American, but people who live in the United States,
yeah,
of course.
I might be.
The High Line, Domino Park, both on the East Coast, and then the Presidio Tunnel Tops, which was more recently completed in San Francisco. But they do work all over the world as you're here. With James, we talk about his early interests, how he ended up studying landscape architecture and urban design, the value of urban design thinking, landscape architecture thinking, the differences between landscape architecture and architecture, his practice, the challenges of the profession, a bunch of other stuff. We talk about the High Line at the very end. It was a wonderful conversation, and I think you guys are going to love it. Sponsors.
Are you tired of juggling multiple pieces of software and struggling with spreadsheets that aren't made for the realities of design and architecture in 2023? Built by and for designers and architects, Programma's all-in-one suite of tools has everything modern studios need for every stage of a project. Mood boards, the world's best specification tools, procurement tracking, project management, and more. All smartly integrated, easily shareable, and always up to date, reducing time-consuming double handling and costly errors. Share your work in various formats, from PDF to client-friendly, up-to-date online dashboards. Join the ranks of leading studios using Programma today. Click the Programma link in our show notes to start for free. If you're starting to laser scan your renovation projects for accurate as-builts, a client at some point has probably handed you some wonky CAD drawings from 17 years ago. Enter Integrated Projects, or IPX for short. IPX is a scan-to-BIM platform that converts your 3D point cloud file from any major LiDAR camera into standardized BIM and CAD files. The best part is that their website lays out the price and turnaround time instantly. Start that interior renovation project on the 50-yard line with accurate drawings in 3D and 2D. Click the IPX link in our show notes to get your first instant quote.
The Second Studio podcast is made possible by support from Autodesk. Autodesk has been part of the design conversation since 1982, providing the tools that help architects around the globe imagine and create beautifully designed, memorable buildings that people love and admire.
Autodesk supports the work of the Second Studio, bringing the architecture community together, sparking curiosity, and leading vibrant interviews with the industry's visionaries and thought leaders. The Second Studio works hard to carry the architecture conversation forward, and Autodesk is proud to contribute to this podcast. You can learn more about Autodesk by clicking on the link in the episode notes.
This is The Second Studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, James. Here we go.
Well, I was born in a town called Preston, which is in the north of England near Manchester. What was nice about that environment is it was very close to a variety of natural settings like the Lake District and the Peak District, which are really beautiful, hilly landscapes with forests and lakes and streams, and great for hiking and camping and climbing and this sort of thing. And at the same time, a very close proximity to a city like Manchester that, as I got a little older, into my teens, was just a great club scene. So this collusion, or this marriage between sort of, the wilds of nature and weather and being out in the big world of nature, combined with life in the city and cafes and clubs and pubs and friends and all of that. It was a great marriage between these two different worlds.
That's a great description. I like that. So when you were a kid and through teenage years, did you know that eventually you were going to study landscape architecture? Did you have any kind of ideas of what that was? Did you know what landscape architecture was?
No, I had no idea. And in England, unlike the US, when you're 18 years old and you're going to university, you sort of need to pick your topic. You're going to be a vet, or you're going to be a doctor, or you're going to be an accountant. Mm-hmm. And I really was not sure what I wanted to do at all. And I studied a matrix, and you plug into the matrix the topics that interest you the most, and they point you in career directions. So my A-level subjects were geography, biology, art, and geology for a kind of a science, a social science, and an artistic strand. And the matrix led me to things like land surveying. Could have been a land surveyor, making maps and cartography. Environmental science, you could learn about the environment and ecology and become an ecologist or environmental planner, environmental scientist. And then there's this thing called landscape architecture. And I really had to kind of look into what that was. But in many ways, it married together all of those interests. So very much focused on the land, very much focused on environment and ecological and biological processes, natural systems. But at the same time, you had to bring a good deal of creativity to the work, and especially with a spatial and formal sense. So obviously drawing and sculpture and making models was all part of it. And so that's how I fell into it.
Oh, that's pretty good. So the creative strand or streak that you had in your background, was it painting, drawing, model making? What was that prior to landscape architecture?
It's actually threefold. It was classic education in drawing, so figure drawing and still life drawing, very very precise hand-eye coordination type drawing. I also took classes in engineering drawing, technical drawing, where you're sort of drawing nut and bolt assemblies of engineered details. So the whole idea of plan section, axonometric, measured drawings, and projection systems was familiar to me. And of course, figure drawing is much more gestural, and you're trying to capture not only line and light and contour, but also character and mood. And thirdly, there was clay. I was making ceramics and pots and working with clay. Pretty interesting. You've
That's
asked me the question. You're taking me back in time, but that sort of threefold aspect of art, from measured, precise drawings to artistic gestural work to working with your hands with clay. I think all of that is really fundamental in shaping who I am as a designer, and working with the land, which in a sense is a very plastic medium, not unlike clay.
I like that. That's a great take. That's really interesting. And also the technical drawing is very different from the live drawing and very different from the clay. It's an odd thing. We often get asked from listeners, who a lot of our listeners are architects, but they want to know if they're preparing for undergrad school to get a bachelor's in architecture or landscape architecture or something like that. Like, what do I do to prepare? Do I have to learn how to do, in our case as architects, construction drawings? Do I learn software? And it's a piece of advice I often give is, I think you should just take any course where you have to make something, where there's a creative process, just anything. It doesn't, if it's physical, that's better perhaps, but anything where you have to make something. Because I do find that those skills translate, even if it's quite indirectly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you're taking me back down memory lane a bit, but one of the exams or kind of interview tests I was assigned at one of the schools I was interviewing at to join as a student. They gave me 10 minutes to draw an explanatory drawing of a wheelbarrow. Now, at first sight, that sounds kind of easy, but it's actually not. I mean, a wheelbarrow is actually quite a difficult little thing to annotate and construct the drawing of. So I always like to if I'm interviewing somebody, I often play that trick on them and ask them to draw an explanatory drawing of a wheelbarrow. And it's funny just how few people, no matter how well trained they are, actually find that quite a difficult assignment. Anyway, to your question, I was chairman and professor of landscape architecture and urbanism at the University of Pennsylvania for 25 years. And I would interview many students, and we had a very close liaison with the architecture department. So there was a very close relationship between landscape and architecture, which was very productive. And some of the best graduates were dual degree students that took architecture and landscape. And I think the two fields share a lot on the one hand, but they're very different on the other. So on the one hand, the attention paid to drawing and visualization is key and fundamental. And being able to understand plan, section, scale, a diagram, three-dimensional modeling. Now, of course, everything's digital and parametric. So being capable with working with those media and being able to visualize space and form and shift scale from sort of the big scale conception all the way down to the detail. These things are very important and shared by both landscape and architecture. Awareness of materiality and how materials impact drawings and affect how it is what you're drawing is critical too. But there's also a big difference too in terms of the media. I always think that, if you love really detailing in a hyper precise way, doors and windows and elevations and meticulous sort of details that primarily are steel or glass or concrete, and that's your love and you're absolutely obsessed with detail and fixity, then architecture is probably a better medium for you to continue to learn that craft. If, on the other hand, you really want to work with environments that are very, very place specific, that you have a different sensibility if you're working in Los Angeles or in California than you do if you're working in Northern Canada, than you do if you're working in Mexico or in London. These are all very, very different places, and they have a different, I want to call it a different landscape. Mm-hmm. Being aware of context and being aware of place and being sensitive to all of those characteristics of weather and atmosphere and light and mood and ambiance and how that affects a project is really key in landscape. And secondly, understanding that landscape is a time-based medium. It's a very dynamic medium. It shifts and it changes. It's never static. It grows, it evolves, sometimes decays and erodes. So being less interested maybe in fixity and finality and end, and more agile with regards to a medium that's ultimately dynamic and time-based. It's a different psychology and a different mindset and a different way of drawing, a different way of conceiving, a different way of designing. And so different people have different aptitudes. There are a number of the dual degree students from Penn, for example, both in architecture and landscape. And some of them had these master's degrees in landscape and architecture. And some of them do choose ultimately to work primarily with architectural offices and specifically building projects. And they're very happy doing that and they're very good at that. And there are other people that decide to come into landscape. And, it all depends where their passions are and where their sensibility is with regards to the medium.
Was there ever a moment where you thought maybe you'd be an architect and not a landscape architect?
Well, I studied in Manchester in the School of Architecture, and it was a shared program with landscape and architecture. It's kind of a combined effort. And I think after our second year, we kind of parsed apart, and those that really wanted to focus more on architecture did so, and those that focused more on landscape did so. And I guess I was always impressed with what my friends who went into architecture wanted to do. But I don't know. At the time, I also thought it was a little limiting in a strange way. And there was so much more potential with the landscape medium, so much more potential for variation and variety, and working with different places really interested me. That, the sort of learning you have to do to analyze and think about and be responsive to very particular environments and very particular places was greatly interesting to me. And, I just saw some of my architecture friends, that their task was to design a library. But that library that they were designing could be anywhere. It was never very place specific. And, or design a house, and the house too could be kind of anywhere. So I sort of like the precision and the care and attention paid to detail that's essential in architecture. I do like that. And I could imagine going down that road. But I think the sheer variety of work in landscape is more compelling for me. I mean, as you know, in our portfolio,
you're all over.
Fresh Kills landfill is this 4 square miles of landfill, and trying to imagine that as a new landscape. And then the High Line is a hyper kind of detailed, much smaller, more craft-like project right in the heart of Manhattan. Or the waterfront in Hong Kong, a totally different environment, a different context. So all these different places and all these different types of project, working at very different scales in very different environments, very different ecologies, often very different cultures and mindsets. It's sort of what really appeals to me, as opposed to simply just working through the details of a building.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, because as you were describing why landscape architecture is an interest to you and was to you when you first started, and the fascination with different cultures, sites, and having variety, it's funny because if you were to ask 10 architects what aspect of architecture they like, I think 9 out of 10 would probably say something almost identical to what you said. However, if you look at 9 out of 10 architects' work, you could also easily say that the vast majority of their projects you could rip off the ground and plop it somewhere else, and it wouldn't be much different between the two.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a lot of good architects who, of course, pay very careful attention to place and topography. Obviously, things like light, where the sun is coming from, where it rises, where it sets, the orientation of a building, the responsiveness of a building to topography, whether it's on the hilltop or the slope or the bottom. Of course, architects are paying attention to place and trying to authenticate their building as something unique and responsive to the environment. I'm not saying they don't do that. I'm just saying that when you're working with a bigger medium, that is both hard and soft, it's both organic and inorganic. We're working with concrete and stone and steel and glass on the one hand, but also with soil and plants and ecology on the other hand. So, it's a bigger medium, it's a more fluid medium, and it's very much a time-based medium. So there are certain things you have to let go of.
Mm.
And I know a lot of architects who just can't let go of certain things.
Yeah. Architects are not known for being the let go type.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's like, I don't know, if you cultivate a garden, you have to go with the flow a little bit. The garden will do its own thing over time. And it's the same with bigger projects and bigger sites. And there's so many issues that come into play that lead to a lot of change, a lot of evolution, a lot of emergence, a lot of flexibility. So, it's just a different mindset.
The other thing that came to mind as you were describing landscape architecture and architecture is, it reminds me that a lot of architects, when they become very successful, when you look at their work, there's a similarity across the projects. You could call it a style, you could call it an ethos, principles, you could call it a brand even, although designers and architects kind of poo-poo on that word. But for a landscape architect, and in your profession, is there a similar thing where there's are you or other landscape architects, conscious of trying to have some kind of through line between the projects, or are you trying to actively, is that not a concern at all? Are you trying to avoid that having repetition? Does that make sense?
Certainly in my work and field operations, we always begin with the site and the program and try to produce something fresh and novel and something that's informed and inspired by the site and by the program. I think you kind of have to do that because you're, of course, working with sites that are very specific and environments and ecologies and weather systems that, highly specific. And so I always feel like if you design something that feels quite foreign and alien in landscape terms, it will always feel foreign and alien. It doesn't feel like it's part of the place. So in our work, I think we're always striving to be authentic, and that by default produces some difference. And we have some schemes that are quite formal and quite articulated formally. And some schemes that are very, very fluid and naturalistic and, pastoral. So I don't think field operations are beholden to a particular style, but more to a way of thinking about site, program, and novel ways of forming or organizing and designing those places. Now, there are landscape architects, there are others that have formulated a kind of a style, and that serves them quite well with certain clients because the client kind of knows what they're going to get.
Yeah.
So if they want a sort of geometrically formal approach, then they know to go to person A or B. If they want a more naturalistic and wild and sort of ecological approach, they can go to person C or D. So it's a little bit like in architecture. I mean, you would go to Richard Meier for Richard Meier buildings. You go to Frank Gehry for Frank Gehry buildings.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, a Herzog and de Meuron, I mean, their sheer range and diversity of work is amazing, and their sense of materiality and their sense of design and detail is you can't pin them down. They'll always do a unique job, and that's very impressive actually, because it means every time they have to kind of start again and think again about what their approach will be. So I think it's true in architecture and landscape. There are some landscape architects and some architects that try to innovate every single time and be responsive to the situation. And there are others that have created a sort of a style and a brand and that can work for them because, again, clients like to know what it is they're getting.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting subject to me because I think a lot of architects and landscape architects and other creatives I know probably started off in their careers wanting to have more variety and approach every project as being different because that's the fun. I mean, at least for us and for like-minded people, that's the fun of it. But you do see over time people kind of gravitate toward one thing or another for the right or the not so right reasons. I'm not sure.
Well, but I guess there's I don't know, there's a pursuit of perfection, right? If you can develop a particular style that works with a particular palette of materials or with details or with ideas about space and form, and that's your thing, you can use that to hone and perfect that approach every single time. I mean, maybe Zaha Hadid architects are a good example in that way. I mean, they do have a stylistic approach, but it's a little bit different every time. It's almost a little bit better every single time because they're just honing their sense of direction. So look, I think there's merit to both approaches.
I want you to choose a side. That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm joking.
One more focused and more thematically centered, honing and perfecting what it is they're doing, and another that's just customizing because each project demands a certain uniqueness, a certain customization that suggests innovation.
So you're in school, you get a master's in landscape architecture and urban design from UPenn, I believe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I assume it's through schools when you realized that landscape architecture is the right path for you. Is that when it felt like this was the right thing?
Well, no, because in between Manchester and coming to Penn, I worked with Richard Rogers for a year in London. And Richard Rogers and Partners then was a very small firm. They'd only just completed the Pompidou. Wow. And they had all the acclaim of the Pompidou, and therefore they had credibility, and they were a lot of people were looking at them for the next wave of work. But for me as a young intern, I had full exposure to the three partners at the time because the office was so small, and they would go for beers in the pub in the evening and they would talk about work, and so it was a great learning experience for a year. But one of the projects we worked on was called the Royal Docks, which is a big dockland area in London, and a massive, massive site with water bodies and docks and some old warehouse buildings and storage facilities. And the project was to master plan this site for new development, to transition from post-industrial use to mixed use urbanism. And what struck me, and it struck the partners too, because this is all they talked about in the evening over beer, was how no one knew what they were doing. They admitted as architects that they had been trained in school to work with buildings at a certain scale, not necessarily to be able to renovate these massive buildings or to know what to do with them. They acknowledged they weren't trained to think about planning a site at this scale. The landscape architects on the team didn't know what they were doing either. I mean, they just thought that throwing trees everywhere was the way to go. There was a field ecologist who was very concerned about some bird habitat in the corner of the site. There were parking engineers who just wanted to get thousands of cars in and out as fast as possible. There were branding agents who were trying to think about how to theme the project or how to broadcast the identity of the project. real estate people trying to think about the economics of the thing. And we would have these big meetings with all these different specialists around the table, and no matter who was speaking, nobody else was listening. And in fact, eyes were rolling. So when the bird ecologist spoke about the habitat, everyone kind of yawned. When the traffic engineers talked about moving 5,000 cars in and out every hour, everyone kind of scratched their heads and yawned. When the architects were talking about cutting courtyards into the buildings to let light in, no one seemed interested in that. And, it went on like that. And so what I learned, and the reason I came to America, because Richard said, urban design is really the field with which you can begin to understand all of these components that go into a project of this sort. A much more holistic, much more comprehensive, much more inclusive mindset, where you don't roll your eyes and lose interest when the bird ecologist is talking and the traffic engineer is talking and the real estate person is talking, the architect is talking, the engineer is talking. You actually are interested in all of that, because it's all of that that makes this total environment. And so that's why I came to Penn to study urban design and to get this bigger picture understanding, which is kind of related to urban planning, but with a much more physical, spatial dimension to it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that urban design is I grew up in France and studied architecture in Paris, and we have urbanism in France that we study, but urban design was never a thing. And I have a feeling that it's a very American discipline. I'm wondering if you've seen that trend kind of change and urban design influence, other countries over the last, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're trying to lay a fabric out, a development fabric, and you're thinking about blocks and block sizes, you need to have a general understanding of buildings to know how big or small the buildings can be, and where their fronts and their backs are, where their service sides are, where their public sides are, etc. And you need to have an understanding of blocks in terms of how blocks, in Asia, for example, modern developments, the blocks are way too big. And it leads to massive streets that are 8 or 9 lanes of traffic because the blocks are so big, and it kills the whole idea of walkability and scale. So I think on the one hand, urban design is really important to understand urban fabric and understand scale and the relationship of what you draw in plan in relationship to how buildings and infrastructures and mobility systems work. But I also think there's this second ingredient, which is this more holistic, more comprehensive understanding of an urban fabric. So you're from France, you say, so you think of a city like Paris or London, both extremely walkable, but so richly varied. It's not just architecture, it's not just buildings. There are streets, and those streets have certain characteristics. There are gardens and parks and plazas and piazzas and courts. Programmatically, there are markets and shopping areas and food and cafe areas and small sort of edgy underground districts and other places that are more spectacular and more central and more public. So, I think good urban design is about understanding all of the ingredients that go into a city, not just the buildings and not just the open space, but all of the things, that panoply of ingredients that make a good city. And so that's why I think it's really important, because as long as you have architects really only focusing on buildings and landscape architects only focusing on open space and traffic engineers only focusing on roads and streets, you know, if there's no dialogue and there's no synthesis, then you're creating a very fragmented or broken up kind of idea of a city. So I'm a big advocate of a much more holistic mindset, being able to orchestrate how we think about these mixed-use developments. It's a little bit like a director, a film director. You know, you as a film director, you have to have the highest regard and the highest respect for all of the specialists in your crew, the sound people, the editing people, the lighting people, the costume people, the actors and the actresses, the script writer, you know. But at the same time, you need to dialogue and curate all of those areas of specialization so that you complete a movie that's so complete, so satisfyingly total in all of its sensory and storytelling dimensions that you've done a good job as a director. So to me, urban design is not just mapping out grids or urban development frameworks, but thinking about it in a much more holistic, a much more inclusive and dynamic manner. And in that case, you start to think about a city in that way, it's not unlike a landscape, right? Because again, landscapes have all of this mixture of ingredients too. They have hydrological systems or mobility systems or programmatic and commercial aspects or ecological functions and so on and so forth. So when you start to think, okay, maybe the city is really just like the geography of an ecosystem. It just happens to be mostly hard. It's concrete and asphalt and steel and glass, but it's still in a very dynamic way, not at all a fixed entity, but a living entity. And there's certain dynamics and certain ecological interplays that go on amongst all of the different parts. And so what kind of educational model might you have, or what kind of mindset, professional mindset might you have to be able to understand that and curate that and understand design as really the curation of all of these different systems?
Yeah, that's super well put. It's interesting. So my bachelor's is in architecture, like just architecture. And I do have to say that at the school I went to, we didn't have a lot of exposure to the landscape architecture students, virtually none, even though they were right across the courtyard. But for whatever reason, I became more and more interested in urban design questions, and that led me eventually to getting an urban design, a master's in urban design. Because it seemed like the natural evolution of things. But anyway, from an educational perspective, I would agree. I've always felt like if I were to design an architecture school and curriculum, then urban design would have to be part of it. I don't quite understand how you can study architecture
maybe not. I mean, again, architects like to think they can do everything. And,
No, I'm not necessarily saying that they're trained to do urban design, but I think they have to learn about it.
Why not go to architecture school and just learn how to be a good architect? And I mean, you now see panels with architects talking about politics or climate issues or social issues, and they don't really have expertise in any of that. Why not have a panel and talk about architecture instead? Because that's your expertise. And so I'm not at all against architects focusing on their area of expertise, which is being able to give form to the future and really focusing on the art and craft of buildings. Now, sure, if some of them want to go further, let's say go further now and think more about urbanism and larger scale urban projects, then there's a whole field of expertise there too that's necessary. If they want to embrace landscape, there's a whole body of expertise there too. But I think the notion that you might be able to compress, say, a 2 or 3 year master's degree and have a little bit of everything is a problem. And this was something I saw at Penn, in a number of faculty meetings where there were certain faculty members who wanted to almost conflate the disciplines. So you would take landscape, you take architecture, you take urban planning, and kind of conflate it into a 2 or 3 year degree. And my problem with that is that at the end of that degree, you would be such a generalist, you wouldn't be good at anything. You would not have a portfolio that evidenced skills with either architectural work, landscape architectural work, or urban planning work. You'd be a kind of a generalist. And so, you're not wrong what you're saying. I'm just saying that let's try to remember that any one of these disciplines, whether it's planning, landscape architecture, urbanism, there's a whole lot of expertise that's necessary in each of those areas. And, let's focus on that expertise before we start to add on other things.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're sort of saying the same thing. I don't know about having a 2 or 3 year program at any level, whether it be bachelor's or master's, where you're trying to do all 3 or 4 at the same time.
Right.
But I have seen...
What is it? They say you need a minimum of 12,000 hours of practice before
become an expert.
Become... Well, no, before you become basically proficient. And I think that's kind of true. I mean, you hire people who've completed a 3 year architecture degree or landscape architecture degree. And, they're still very green in terms of professional practice. And, it really does take a number of years in professional practice as well before they begin to become more capable. And I think that's true in many other fields. I mean, they say the same with finance, for example. You can go to business school for 2 years, but then you go and work in a finance investment bank somewhere. And they won't promote you until at least 3 or 4 years in, because they think that's the kind of time it takes for you to learn what it's all about. So, I worry when I see portfolios coming out of schools, and this is common nowadays, where you're seeing incredibly generalized projects, where obviously the studio critic is trying too hard to do too much in too short of time. Mm-hmm. And the students really aren't getting into it. And you can see it in the portfolio, and it's a little bit of a shame. It's like I always think, if you go to film school, you better come out and be able to make a film. If you go to music school, you better come out and be a good musician. If you go to accounting school, you better be a good accountant. And yet you see a lot of people coming out of architecture schools these days with their portfolios, and they have no idea about what really the design of a building and how to put a building together really is all about.
Yes, it's really interesting, because I would also very much agree with that. And it's always been a discussion amongst the educators of architecture. How do we find that right balance between these two? Between learning your craft, which you need to do, but also at the same time, I do think that a lot of really bad architecture and architects have been produced as a result of those architects never being exposed to bigger questions. And certainly when we get to the urban design scale, if you're an architect and you're good at your craft, that's great, but you have to be, at the very least, very curious and concerned and interested in all the stuff that you mentioned, I think. And it's and
look, I think when you start talking about cities in particular, the complexity of cities, the dynamics of cities, what you're actually able to influence in city formation as a planner or designer, I think it takes 10 or 20 years of expertise before you become credible, really, in that area. It's so complex.
Yeah.
So, it just goes back to my point. If you go back to where I was at the beginning, you asked me what I did for drawing, and we did, figure drawing. That really is a way to learn drawing. It's painful. It's embarrassing. Those first drawings you make are so bad. But you persist and you practice and you have a good teacher and you really begin to understand how to see, how to translate what you're seeing into a drawing. Well, that takes time and patience and discipline, but eventually leads to a certain level of expertise. And so what I'm saying is, let architecture students focus on architecture and let landscape architecture students focus on landscape, and let urban designers focus on urbanism. And, eventually those sensibilities can coalesce. There are certainly professionals out there who are very capable, actually, with any one of those media at any scale. But I would warrant that those people are extremely seasoned, decades of experience and rare.
Yeah. And now a quick break to thank the sponsors who support the Second Studio. We are supported by Enscape. Enscape is a real-time visualization and VR tool for the AEC industry. It is also a program that we use in our office. And we like it because, one, it's a plugin and not a separate application, which means we can work natively in our modeling programs such as Revit, SketchUp, Rhino, ArchiCAD, or Vectorworks. Two, it's super easy and versatile. We've used many other rendering programs, and a lot of times they're just difficult to use. That's not the case with Enscape. We can do renderings, 360-degree panoramas, videos, and immersive VR experiences with a breeze. Thirdly, it renders in real time, so we can see the light, shadows, and materials of the renderings as we're working. So start your free trial today by clicking the Enscape 3D link in our show notes.
One of the easiest ways to get accurate existing condition drawings for houses is with an iPhone or an iPad app called Canvas. Canvas is a tool we use on many of our projects. Instead of surveying a home manually, we simply scan it using our iPad, and Canvas processes the scan to produce accurate drawings and even 3D computer models. The file format works with AutoCAD, Revit, ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, SketchUp, and others. It is extremely easy to use, fast, and really has been a huge benefit for us and our clients. Try it out by visiting canvas.io/SSP and get your first as-built free.
Fellow architects and interior designers, if you are looking to elevate your workflows, then we suggest using the BIM computer program ArchiCAD. ArchiCAD leads the industry by enabling architectural and interior design firms around the world to freely design, supported by innovative technology that expands as far as the imagination can stretch. As ArchiCAD continues to evolve with technological advances, architects can push that technology to their advantage while working in an accurate model. Start your fully functioning free trial today by clicking on the ArchiCAD link in our episode notes. So another question we had was talking about becoming a seasoned professional or seasoned expert in something. Was there one project, what was the first project you completed, if there was one, where you felt when it was done that this really started to capture, I don't know, the essence of what you're trying to achieve as a landscape architect, as an urban designer? Was there one project where when it was done, you're like, I'm on to something here. This feels like it's expressing what I'm trying to do in the big picture?
Well, there was I don't know. There was a competition towards the end of my graduate school called Philadelphia City Visions. It was a vision for the city of Philadelphia, just totally open-ended how you could approach that. And I think that was a project that allowed me to really coalesce a lot of my interests, and that I worked in practice for a couple of years, but then very quickly came back into the school as a teacher, a studio teacher, and eventually a tenure-track professor, and then eventually a tenured professor and a chairman of the department. So I had this long academic sort of probably how long was it? Probably 15, 20-year stint in the academy. And I viewed the academy as a place of experimentation. So on the one hand, I really wanted to teach in both the first year and the final year. And in the first year, I just focused on skills. I really wanted to really hammer home drawing, model making, visualization, how you think about design, how you visualize. And then in the third year, totally experimental and totally sort of novel. And so, for example, we would take study tours out to the West and look at the big hydrological projects in the West, the big canal systems and the dams, Hoover Dam, and how Las Vegas kind of came about as a city. So these were pretty, at the time, fresh kinds of takes on landscape. We weren't just designing. It wasn't just a studio designing a small park in around the corner from the campus. We were actually going out, looking at strange places and thinking about them in new and novel ways. And that's really when I knew that something great was beginning to evolve, because we were starting to link or tie landscape to infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So now hydrological systems and how water systems work, both as a means of saving and conserving water for use and for distribution, but also dealing with stormwater and flood water and this sort of thing. Thinking about water as infrastructure, thinking about mobility systems as infrastructure. This was all evolving in my own work and teaching in the 90s. And then I don't know if you know a book I made in the 90s called Taking Measures Across the American Landscape, which was with a very close friend and aerial photographer colleague. We flew across the United States several times. He would take beautiful photographs from the air, and I would make map collages or map drawings. And that together we produced a book. And the whole idea of the book was to explain why you see certain forms and patterns and geometries and systems across the American landscape. Mm-hmm. We have a grid, but why do we have a grid, and how was the grid even surveyed, and how was it laid out, and how was it made, and what sort of fabric did it generate? Or you see certain farming and agricultural patterns. Why are they the way they are? What's the driver behind those kinds of forms and geometries? Or looking at hydrological systems in the West, or even agricultural systems and how they work. So it was a great sort of mind-opening exploration of the American landscape at an infrastructural scale that I thought was really quite innovative and eye-opening at the time, and began to lead to ways of thinking. And then I think the thing that just broke through and kind of began to take me out of the academy and into practice was a competition for Downsview Park in Toronto in 1999, I think it was. And that was an invited competition, and there were some big stars in the five, the Bernard Tschumi and OMA. And but I approached that project as if it were infrastructure, which had come from my previous experiments, if you will. And we did very well in that competition. It got a lot of accolades, and it led eventually to an urban design study for the North Delaware River in Philadelphia, which is 10 miles long. So all of a sudden I was working on this 10-mile long project. and then eventually the Fresh Kills competition, which again was another competition with some stars. And I think we approached that in a very novel and very different way. Super site responsive, program responsive, and we won that, and that eventually led to the opening of the office and the opening of the practice. And it's been going on like that since. I love looking for different types of projects. Some of them very big and complex, some of them very small and very simple, some of them detail and craft and material and tactile oriented, some of them more infrastructural and system oriented. So I as I said at the beginning, what keeps me in the field and keeps me at work in the practice is the sheer diversity of project types and issues that come to the board.
Do you still participate in a lot of design competitions, or is most of the work you do? I mean, I feel like at this point people must be just coming to you.
Well, I wish that were true. Competitions are hard work, and from a commercial point of view, you can lose a lot of money. I think most people will tell you that when they do a competition in architecture or landscape architecture, and it's a big, competition of significant scope, they'll tell you that they're probably spending $300,000 to $500,000 worth of professional time for what might just be a $50,000 stipend.
Yeah.
That $50,000 stipend will pay for the travel that's necessary for the interviews, and maybe it will pay for a bit of the reprographic costs, but it's nowhere near covering the time and effort. You're typically going to put six people on it, maybe more, especially towards the end when all the production is due. So competitions have become quite irritating. And also, as the years tick by and there are more and more competitions, the clients expect more. So it used to just be that you would do 4 boards, present 4 boards. Now it's like 10 boards, a video animation, a cost estimate, a technical report, several models, multiple presentations and meetings. It's really become very, very crazy and unfair and sort of unsustainable. Now, having said that, I think when we look at our projects, I'm thinking the best and most important projects were all won through competition. So Fresh Kills, the High Line, the Presidio, Chicago Navy Pier, Cleveland Public Square. Our work in Hong Kong was a kind of mini competition, but still had to put a big effort in to win that job. Almost all the really big, juicy projects have been won through competition, and they're hard won. And we've also lost some. And the ones we lose, my goodness, you feel that for weeks. It's painful, painful. I remember Governor's Island in New York. Governor's Island is in the harbor.
Yeah.
And boy, oh boy, did we want that. And we worked so hard on it and put a huge effort in. And West 8 won the competition. And the next day, it was on the front page of the New York Times. And that really pissed me off.
It's just kicking you when you're down.
Well, never before has a landscape architectural project been on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah.
I think the High Line made it
I was going to say.
one point.
Yeah.
But, when you lose it, it hurts for a long time, and it replays in your mind, what could we have done differently? What could we have done differently? And so I'm very ambivalent about competitions. I think on the one hand, they're extremely hard work, they're onerous, the clients are getting increasingly abusive in terms of what they think they can get for nothing.
Yeah.
We do it to ourselves as a profession. I mean, everybody jumps in, all hands on deck. And, if there's 5 entries, 4 are going to lose, and those 4 that lose are going to feel the pain. So on the other hand, if you win, it's a great project, and if you're an architect and you win a big museum project, it can be very gratifying and very important, and a very significant, perhaps career-changing project. Similarly, a landscape architect, you win a massive park or massive waterfront or a big urban development project somewhere. It can be transformative in terms of the economics of the office, the reputation, credibility of the office, access to new types of work. So I'm very ambivalent about them. I hate them, but as long as they're around, you've kind of got to do them, and you've got to play to win.
Yeah, we've heard pretty much the same narrative from architects as well, especially in the UK or in Europe, where competitions are a bit more common on the architecture side of things.
Even more abusive, though. I mean, the European ones are really abusive. And so I'm in addition to the poetic and creative and innovative and sort of intellectual and critical aspects of our field, I'm also very interested in the professional aspects too, and the sort of credibility that we have in the broader world. Just how seriously are architects taken by politicians or by big decision makers or CEOs? How seriously are you really taken, and how do you improve your relevance to a broader public? How do you communicate the relevance of what we do and why it's important, and also why it's worth investing in and doing properly, not just looking for the cheapest, fastest way to put up a building, but how to do a building well, and how to do a project well, and how to invest in that project properly. And how, as architects and landscape architects, do we maintain professional practices where we can pay our people decently and not get locked into very, very low salaries, low costs of living, often in very expensive cities, whether that's Paris or London or New York or Los Angeles. You're asking people after 3 years of graduate school, often with debt, to work for a salary that they could probably do better being an Uber driver or work in a restaurant. And that, career prospects are not that great.
Yeah.
And so I'm very interested too in how we improve the profile of the profession to try to be a lot more professional about how we work with projects, how we work with clients, how we understand contracts and fees and schedules and deliverables in such a way that it's a much more professional operation, properly compensated, as opposed to a lot of boutique small shops just competing with one another and seemingly happy or unhappy that they have no money and they can't seem to get by.
Yeah, that's a great topic. That's partly why this show exists, to help people understand what we do, I think. But it's I think sometimes too, the profession, when I say the profession, of course, I think about architecture, but some of this probably extends to landscape architecture. It kind of does itself a disservice. I think especially when we talk about how we treat our employees, or even sometimes even in school. And architecture has always been a history of sort of a toxic place to be at, hyper competitive, but in not the positive way. Things like this.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, sure, there's a sort of a self-indulgent, critical intellectual fetishism that can exist.
Yeah.
That can exist. It's a problem.
Yeah.
But I don't think the inverse is good either. I
I
don't
agree.
think
Yeah.
touchy-feely, feel good, don't overwork, don't try too hard.
Yeah.
Anything goes.
Yeah.
I still think that there are standards and expectations, and it's a little bit like the figure drawing assignment. You do have to pin up your figure drawing that you did that afternoon, and there is going to be a critique. And a good teacher will point out, we'll probably go to the better drawings and explain why they are the better drawings. And a really bad teacher will just dig into everyone about how bad they are. So
That's fair.
I do think there's a thing called constructive criticism, where you are exercising critical judgment. You are trying to raise the bar. You know what the standards are. You know what the skills are. You know what it is you're looking for, and you try to help students understand why something is working better than something else, and that why is something that they can continue to work on to become better themselves over time. So I think in some of the schools I've been to recently, there's an aversion now to criticism. There's, my goodness, don't say anything in case you upset somebody. And it's phony. I mean, it's just producing really weak work where there's no sense of standard. It's a world in which anything goes, and weak, mediocre stuff can sit equally alongside really good stuff.
Yeah.
So, it's not an either-or thing. It's not radical, intense, fetishistic, over-intellectualized criticism on the one hand, but neither should it be over-generalized pandering and hand-holding on the other hand.
It's interesting you say that, because we're having a discussion about this particular aspect of education not long ago, and I have seen. It's hard to speak in generalities, but I have seen more and more schools especially at the undergraduate level, where they've become, let's say, softer or too afraid to say things, and it makes me uncomfortable and nervous. I don't think people should be assholes, but we have to talk about when
my daughter just completed film school at NYU, and I have to say I was really impressed with that program and the kinds of things that she learned there. Because every course and every assignment is nothing other than filmmaking, period.
Awesome.
So if there's a seminar on the history of film, they watch outtakes from films and they discuss them in their historical context. If there's a sort of theory and criticism of film, they do it by watching film outtakes, and then they talk about how a particular scene was masterful because, and it was masterful because of the way the camera worked, or because the way the sequencing or the editing put it together in a particular sequence, or because of the way it was lit, or because of the way the actor was curated. So everything's sort of about the craft of filmmaking. And their assignments, they have to write a little script and go out and make a film for a 5 or 10 minute segment of film, and how that is put together and how it's made and how it's directed. And so I I would urge all of the architecture schools and landscape architecture schools and schools of planning to really get back to what we do in a very, very specialized and focused way, and stop trying to open up the Pandora's box of every political, social, issue you can think of. Let's learn the craft, and then we can bring our politics to bear after that.
Interesting. Are you still involved with teaching or education in any way these days, or is it just the practice?
I really don't have the patience anymore. I mean,
what does that mean?
Well, to students are a little bit like a herd of sheep, and you have to really corral them, and so it's not good enough to simply assign a problem and sit back and let them do some work and have them pin up the work and talk about it. I really think you actually have to sit with them and help them to draw and to visualize and to think. And so that takes a conversation. It's a desk crit, right? You're sitting at the desk with them. You're asking them what they're thinking about and how they're approaching the work and what's kind of in their mindset. And then you have to spend time helping them to take that to the next level of development, whether that's more visualization, or let's make a physical model, or let's do a quick study of this, or go and look at these precedents to learn from those. It all takes time. And I just don't have the patience for it anymore. And secondly, something happens when you become a bit of a star, and that is that the students tend to look at you as if you have all the answers, and they're looking for you to shape and guide them.
Yeah.
And I much prefer students who are totally independent and are actually bringing their own thoughts to the table. So, I'd rather have a herd of sheep that's actually really difficult to herd, as opposed to a herd of sheep that's just looking at me to steer them in the right direction. So it's a combination of you just grow a little older, a little grumpier, a little less patient. But also, I think the stardom is a bit of a problem too, with a student-teacher relationship, where you really want them to feel confident to develop their own voice and not simply look at you all the time for the guidance.
That's really, really interesting to hear, and certainly something I've not experienced. But I have taught. So the patience thing, I do actually understand a little bit. Talking about your practice, how large is your practice? Like, how many people do you have? How many projects do you have going on? Do you keep it small? Do you keep it big?
Well, we're about 100 people.
Jeez.
About 65, 70 in New York.
Wow.
15 or so in Philadelphia. Much cheaper, more affordable city than New York. So typically when the younger talent decide they want to get married and maybe look at a house, they ask if they can go to Philadelphia.
That's funny.
But the Philly office is a great office. Some super talented and a lot of energy and good work coming out of there. And then we also have about 15 people in San Francisco. And the same thing. Those are typically people who prefer to be on the West Coast. So the offices aren't anywhere in particular for strategic reasons other than retaining talent. We started in New York. I bear in mind, I was in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania opening the office, and the young graduates I wanted to hire said, "Hey, we're not staying here. We want to be in New York." And so I opened the office in New York primarily because that's where the young talent wanted to be.
Wow.
But as some of them grew older and wanted to settle down a little bit more, the idea of Philadelphia came about. And then there were a couple of people who needed to move back to the West Coast because their families were there. So we opened the San Francisco office. So that's how it kind of evolved. Now, having said that, let's say that's 100 people. At the moment, we have something like 70 active projects.
Wow.
Which is ridiculous. Just ridiculous. Yes.
Wow.
But a lot of them are small and they're bits and pieces of things. And it's one of the things that really differentiates landscape architecture offices from architecture offices because, if you talk to Greg Pasquarelli at Shop Architects, for example, they're a little over 100 people, 120, I think he said. I asked him how many projects they've got. He said about 15.
15?
But,
what?
Yeah, but
it must be massive projects.
Yeah.
But each of those are pretty big projects. It's a tower or a museum or a sports stadium or So, and that's say, 15 to 20 projects for 100 people. And typically with those projects, typically with an architectural project, you have a client who has already made a determination about the budget and the schedule. And when you sign the contract with them, they stick to the budget and the schedule and they move forward. So as an architect, you're getting a tower building, it's going to last you for 4 years. It's going to stay on schedule because the developer wants it built and open by a certain date. And that you can put a team of 8 people on that project and you have the fee revenue to support it. In landscape architecture, our projects are so much smaller. So yes, we might have a few big parks, and the Seattle Central Waterfront, for example, is a massive project. So yes, we might have 2 or 3 big projects, but just to survive economically, we need to take a lot of other things too. And so I think the agility we have to have, just both administratively, managerially, how we staff projects and how staff move around, because you're looking to move them here and there. Next week, we're going to move them around again. You're continually juggling balls and trying to catch them before they hit the ground. And the kind of mental agility you need to shift from this type of project to that type of project, to this detail, to this thing, is really phenomenal. And I think it's a major difference between landscape architectural offices and architectural offices, that there's so much more going on that we have to deal with, and that can also be quite unstable, because we have a lot of clients who don't necessarily have a budget in place yet.
Yeah.
Or they don't have a schedule in place yet. So therefore they can stop and start, or they can change their budget expectations or change their programming expectations. So it's very different. The people I feel even worse for are lighting designers.
I was just going to say that.
Because those offices need, if we need 70, they need 200.
Yeah.
And if you're a graphic designer, you might have a few big corporate clients that are looking for a full rebrand, but those aren't going to support and sustain you full time. You're going to have dozens of smaller things to keep going. And so a lot of people I know in graphic design, communication arts, lighting design, they talk about the same things we do, except it's even harder. They're juggling so many balls.
I'm wondering, is part of the challenge that you're describing, does it come from the fact that I would say generally from what I've seen, for the average person, let's say the average client, the non-architect, non-landscape architect, non-contractor person, when they think of a project, almost at whatever scale, they think of an architect, and they think of a contractor, and an engineer. That's probably the first three. And then what I've seen, landscape architect is fourth, but sometimes way, way down on that list. Like there's a big gap.
Right.
And then lighting designer is like way, way at the very bottom.
Right.
Is that part of the challenge for the profession of landscape architecture?
Well, it depends on the project. I mean, it might be that it's a massive building, it's a massive project, and it really is all architecture and engineering. And there's a small plaza or a small courtyard that constitutes landscape,
right?
And that's fine. I mean, you're playing a small role in that project. But there are other projects. I mean, most of the projects we are engaged in are ones where we're in full collaboration with the architect, because probably 40 to 50% of the ground area is open to the sky. So sure, there are still those big architectural projects where there's a gem of a courtyard or a gem of a rooftop or a small piazza. We'll do those because they're interesting, and there's often interesting details and craft experiments you can try out. But sure, in the context of that team, we're a very small part of the team. But the majority of our projects, we're playing an equal collaborative role, especially at that stage of just trying to organize the site or figure out circulation or figure out where the building footprints go in relationship to open space, and what the dialogue is between the interior and the exterior, where the lobbies go, where retail fronts go, how all of this can help to activate and create a much more dynamic public realm. And in those cases, we're equal partners in terms of the urban design, the urban development. At some point, the architects will go into design development documentation and really focus on the buildings, and we will begin to really focus on the construction and material details of the open space. But yeah, you're right. It's sometimes irritating. It's sometimes irritating when you are deeply involved on a project. You know you're not a bit player. You know what you've done. Everyone knows the role that you've played. And then you see it in the media, or you see it advertised, and there's no mention. There's no mention of your role. And that's really bothers me a lot, because a little bit like the film director role, a good film director will acknowledge everybody down to the costume designer, to the lighting guy. I mean, they know all of the contributors are absolutely fundamental, and the expertise that they bring is so important. So, that's sometimes our role. I sometimes think that some landscape architects feel like they're a little bit of what we'll call a good wife. The good wife from the 1950s, who was always behind the scenes, never really showcased, or the spotlight wasn't on the good wife, but the good wife makes the husband look good,
right?
And all the mistakes and errors and problems that the husband makes, the good wife solves them, resolves them, and fixes things, and but never any acclaim, never any spotlight. So I can think of multiple times where we've really played just a massive role, hand-holding the team through a project, and yet that hasn't ever really been credited or cited. And so it's kind of annoying too.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a few, but I know we're coming up on the time. Unrelated to the last bit, I did want to ask about the High Line, which you're probably just sick and tired of talking about. But just briefly,
love that.
We were in New York, as we told you, I think, and we were there before it was completed and after it was completed, and it's evolved, obviously, as you know, tremendously since it was first done. Not just in terms of the greenery, coming in and growing in, but just as a kind of a cultural phenomenon and what's done for the meatpacking in Chelsea and all these things. So I guess the one question is, what has it been like to create the High Line and then see it have this a bigger impact than maybe anyone ever thought it would potentially have?
Right. Well, part of the reason we got the job is we developed a sort of manifesto at the very beginning that asked the question, what will grow here? And we juxtaposed two photographs. One photograph is the old rail bed, the old rail bed as it was originally, which was just stone and concrete and steel. That was it. Very gray and all inorganic, hard, stony, concretey materials. And then, as you know, when the trains stopped running, seeds dropped, birds dropped seeds, and seeds began to take root. And as those grasses grew, and as they died every year, their material would create more soil. And over a number of years, there was this self-generation of soil that allowed more and more plants to grow. So when we looked at it, it had evolved into this kind of green meadow. And it's very sort of interesting. And so by asking what will grow here, the provocation was not only what will grow here in terms of perhaps new gardens and new plantings, but what might grow here in terms of new communities, new neighborhoods, new buildings. What might grow here in terms of new programs and new uses and new experiences. And so, one of the sensibilities, as I said at the beginning, of a landscape architect is you always have to understand a project as something that inevitably grows, it inevitably evolves. You can take an aerial photograph of a plot of land and extrapolate that over every 5-year period. And, by the time you get to year 20, it's totally different. You can even do the same with urban spaces, like urban piazzas and squares, just a slow release photography over a number of years. And it's different. It might not be physically different, but it's being used in different ways as different uses and different programs come into vogue. So this understanding that things are never fixed, that they're dynamic, they change, they grow, was part of an understanding of what we thought was innate to the High Line. It was inherent to the very nature of the High Line. It was this growing entity that would inevitably change and would inevitably change the environment around it too. The development environment, the economic environment, the programmatic environment, the social environment. And so that's how we began. And the book that we made, the High Line, there are 5 chapters. The last one is called The Unforeseen. And that's just like a photo collection, photo catalog of things that happen on the High Line that we had no idea would ever happen. Like an opera singer coming out of her apartment to sing opera in the evening, randomly, on her balcony. Or a stargazing club that formed and brought telescopes up onto the High Line to look at the stars. Or people having sex up against the glass of the hotel windows. Pure
I do remember.
Exhibitionism.
Yeah,
pure exhibitionism. Well, we never anticipated any of this. We thought that the High Line would be a beautiful garden. It would be a beautiful strolling path. You would have this amazing scenography of views and vistas and panoramas out to the river and across the city. It would be an intriguing experience simply because of the blocks that it moves through and how it moves through. But we never really foresaw the intensity and the variety of things that have since happened. Even the plant growth, the way the plants have grown. We were really worried that we only had like at most 18 inches of soil in an environment that's subject to incredible heat in the summer and incredible cold in the winter and wind. We were worried if anything would really make it. But in actual fact, things have grown, and some things have grown bigger than you would ever have imagined. So it continues to surprise. And that was always the impulse from the very beginning. The discovery of this green meadow that lived on the High Line was a big surprise. Nobody knew it was there because nobody could see it. A handful of people who lived in nearby apartments could maybe see it. But most people just saw the High Line as a hulking bulk of steel and had no idea there was this green ecology on top. So the most exhilarating experience of the High Line as a found object is the sense of surprise. And so when we designed it, we wanted to curate a whole sequence of surprises that as you walk along and as you journey along and you go from block to block to block, there's something else surprising you. And it might be a group of plantings that are just completely spectacular and unbelievable that they're there. Could be bird song that's particularly effusive. It could be butterflies. It could be views out to the street below, and you're seeing action in the street below that you feel a bit voyeuristic looking into, but it's interesting. You're walking past apartment windows and you can see people cooking or people sitting and watching TV. And then you see other people too on the High Line. And I like to call it, a dialogue really between the exhibitionist and the voyeur. Mm-hmm. There are obviously people in the High Line who are just there for exhibitionism. They're out to be seen. And there are other people kind of sitting in the recesses and standing in the recesses, just people watching. It's just fascinating to see all these different people from all these walks of life. So yes, the High Line has grown into an extraordinary phenomena filled with surprise. And I hope and I believe that it will continue to do so. I think the High Line that you see 5 years from now and 10 years from now will be something a little different in terms of how it's being used and what it looks like.
That's fantastic. I love that description. It's really amazing how the High Line has become this device to kind of bring to the surface a lot of urban social conditions and heighten them and bring new ones. It's fantastic. We went past the hour.
It's a feel-good thing. It's a feel-good thing too. I mean, really, it followed 9/11.
True.
And part of Mayor Bloomberg's thinking was, let's do a feel-good project. Let's show that New York can come back, kind of thing. And of course, there was all that investment in the site and the World Trade Tower site. But the High Line was another investment made to just try to revitalize the city. And again, a big surprise for me is just the psychology of the High Line. People love it. I mean, it makes people feel good. And, it's just amazing. I don't know if we foresaw all of that emotional weight. We didn't think that it would be something that everybody could fall in love with, but it did, and it's extraordinary. And now we're seeing cities everywhere around the world wanting their own High Line. Now,
Yeah.
they're not going to have a High Line because I always say that 80% of New York's High Line is New York. It's that borrowed landscape of the city around. And, many other cities have very different contexts and very different environments. So, but, a lot of cities are looking for this next sort of public space investment that can make a difference, that can make people feel good and make them want to stay and enjoy. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I don't know if you were in New York in the early 80s, but in the early 80s, most public spaces and parks were derelict and abandoned, filled with homelessness or with crime or with drug dealers. Bryant Park or Central Park were completely ruined. Nobody would go in there. And New York was really just about people running around, running to get into the office and running to get home. And that was it. And now we have this fabulous texture of waterfronts and parks and highlines and piazzas and squares and walks and sidewalks where, people are no longer in so much of a rush. They want to enjoy their experience in the city. And they want to go to different places to see different people, to be part of the scene, and to participate in the life of what it means to live in a city and to have fun. It's not just a place to live and work. It's also a place to have great experiences and to enrich your life because you live in New York. And I think that's the biggest lesson learned from the High Line, and why many, many other cities around the world are really looking to invest in public spaces that can really make a difference to how their workers and residents and visitors feel.
The High Line really is a great, great champion for the power of public space and somewhat novel public space too, I think.
Yeah.
That's the great impact that has had. We haven't been to New York City in many years, but you're making us miss it dearly. So now I got
well, where do you live?
We're in LA and San Francisco.
Well,
not bad places.
What I love about LA is just the range of natural environments that,
yes.
I mean, you can go up into the hills and the canyons and the beaches. And if you drive east a little bit into the mountains, LA's got this really interesting dialogue between urbanism and these big nature, big natural environments, which I really like. And it's a big city. I love that. I love density and intensity, and you feel in LA that you're going from neighborhood to neighborhood. It's a bit of a drag that everything's automobile culture, but okay, that's part of it, I suppose. And then San Francisco. I mean, San Francisco almost feels like a little bit of a small town sometimes.
Yes,
but. Boy, what a beautiful natural environment that sits in too, with the Pacific coast and the bay. You may know our project there, the Presidio Tunnel Tops.
Yep. I was just there a few weeks ago.
Which is, great. What a great site. I mean, that was a competition. That was one we really wanted to win because of the site. I mean, how can you go wrong when you have such a spectacular site like that, overlooking the bay and the Golden Gate Bridge and looking back to the skyline of San Francisco? So, all these cities have great characteristics, and I think the best cities moving forwards, the ones that will continue to compete and attract the creative classes and be successful as cities, are the ones that sort of recognize what their key assets are and really work to leverage their assets, really learn to leverage the character that they have as cities and differentiate themselves from others. I think cities make a big mistake when they They try to emulate others, and they try to look like another city. I think, Paris does not feel like London. Neither of them feel like New York. None of them feel like LA. I love the fact that we have these different cities, these different experiences, these different feelings and moods. And the trick moving forwards is how to maintain those differences and maintain their appeal.
I love that. I'll say super briefly that I have seen with small towns that's a particular issue where you have developers and real estate developers. Right. They just want to copy. Right. Well, look at what, I don't know, Santa Barbara did. Look at what whoever did. Yeah. And it's sometimes difficult to, as a architect, urban designer, whatever title, to say there's an essence to this place that is unique. But it's difficult to describe, or it's difficult for people to understand because it's not quantifiable on an Excel sheet. So, but this maybe gets back to your point of communicating to others the value of what we all do.
Yeah. It's geography, and geography is the art of places, and why places are the way they are. And a lot of it is cultural history and social history and economic logics as to why certain cities developed economically. Places are different, and I just hope that we can continue to make a world that really celebrates difference and enjoys difference and stops. I mean, this is particularly true in Asian cities where, they all start to look the same when it's all the same glass and steel towers, and the same approach towards urbanism. I kind of think, places should know what it is that they have inherited, why they are the way they are, and how they can leverage that to create more uniqueness and more difference.
I love it. We went past our hour and a half mark by a little bit.
Yeah, okay. I was hoping we'd be done in an hour, so you got... Okay, so that was fun. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the show, then you can leave a review of it in the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, also YouTube.
Yes, and we also have the website, secondstudiopod.com, where all of the episodes are. You can find us on social media, really mostly on Instagram. We have a good community there. We post pretty regularly, so check that out. And of course, we also have the hotline.
Yes.
213-222-6950 that you can call and leave a voicemail or send a text message. If you have any guest suggestions, any questions, anything you would want us to talk about, topic
suggestions, always appreciated.
Feel free to reach out.
I'm always like, are we going to run out of things to discuss?
No, I don't think so.
Let's see what else. More amazing guests coming up. And I hope you guys are enjoying it. We appreciate that all of you are listening. And we'll talk soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.